We have a green light. That's always good. Okay, please move it up 2 slides. Chapter 5 in 2nd Chronicles is a summary chapter, and there are several things that are brought together, and the things that are brought together in the different summaries run concurrently from the beginning of David's kingdom till the end of his kingdom. There are like 5 or 6 things here that the author summarizes. And there are some interesting things. Each one of these things will preach if somebody was of a mind to preach and not teach, but each of these would actually preach. And so if you'd move it up 1, please, Aretha. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron, and they said, "Look, we are your people, bone and flesh. For some time while Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. The Lord said to you, it is you who shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you who shall rule over Israel." So we see here that David did not conquer the northern kingdom of Israel and force his kingdom upon them. In fact, at this point, they came voluntarily, but it didn't happen all at once. It took 7 years for this to occur. He didn't go out and try to force himself on them. He waited for them to recognize what God was doing in his life and to recognize what God was doing among the people of Israel. And so they eventually came to him and they said, "You're the shepherd." Now apparently, according to the verse 2, they were aware of the prophecy that Samuel had given David years and years previously, that the Holy Spirit would be removed from Saul, the Spirit would be put on David's head, and he would be the anointed one. He would be the one that would be the next king. But it didn't happen for years and years and years, and we'll see in the next verse that even after he became king of Judah, it took 7 years before the other tribes came to him and said, "Look, we want you to be king for us too. We recognize your military achievements that have occurred years ago, probably 10 or 12 years prior to this." We know that from the next verses that David was 30 years old at this point, so maybe he was 18 or 20 when he was in the military and led the early fights against the Philistine people and the Canaanite people. And so it took till he was 30 years old for them to recognize the anointing that was upon David's life, and they came to him and they said, "We want you to be our ruler." So this is kind of not the way that usually leaders in the Middle East come to power. Usually the leader kills the person before them, and then therefore they become the leader. And David refused to do that, even though he had ample opportunity to kill Saul. He wouldn't let his people harm him. He waited for God to do it. And so this is really Christianity. Not take your own personal vengeance and wait for God to work it out. Any comments on that? Next slide, please. So all the elders of Israel, this would be, it's almost like the 13 colonies of the United States. They came together, the elders of Israel, which are the 10 tribes, those that are not Judah. They came to the king at Hebron, and the king David made a covenant with them before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. This is why I ran our church covenant this morning as a responsive reading. We haven't done it in a long time since COVID. We haven't done our responsive readings, but today I did it. We don't know what the covenant was that they made. It might have been just as simple, we'll recognize you as being king, and we'll do what we can for the country. And they made an agreement, a covenant, which is more than a legal document. A covenant is something that can't be abrogated. It's not simply signing, we'll do this and you do that. There's more to it than that. Now notice that it says they anointed David. Now I've made this point before, but the word anointed is the same word as Christ. Christ is not the name of Jesus. Christ is his title. He is anointed for the special work that God sent him to do. And here David, who is a type of Christ, because the Christ is said to be the son of David, he's a type of Christ, he's a type of deliverer. His ministry will be deliverance. He didn't come to full peace with all the nations around him. That was his son Solomon. It was the next generation that was blessed to reap the fruits and the peace and the wealth and the prosperity and all the things that David did, because all the armies of the nations around them were defeated, and so his son could live in peace, and the people of Israel could live in peace during the time of David's son Solomon. So he was anointed. Now, I was watching something recently of people that had survived Auschwitz, and they were little kids that are now very old people. And two of them said, they were talking about when the Americans rolled in, and when the Germans disappeared, and then the Americans rolled in, and two of them said to the people who came to liberate the camps, "You are the Messiah. You are our deliverer. You have saved our lives. All this wickedness has gone on around us. You are the one that God anointed to come and save us and to give us our lives." So they understood at the time of Christ that the deliverer would be somebody who would save them. Their thought of being saved was being saved from the Romans, but God's idea of being saved is to be saved from sins. It was a much broader salvation. So the elders, the leaders, these are people that are recognized. These are not people that are elected. We do our elections here for elders every year, but elders are those who are recognized as being leaders. And so they came and they made a covenant with David on behalf of the people that they represented. And so now it's like the United States of Israel, which consists of all 12 tribes. Any comments on that? David was 30. Next slide, please. David was 30 years old when he began to reign. So we understand that all of that crap that he went through in the previous chapters occurred over probably a 10 or 12 year period, probably closer to 10. So he began to reign. He reigned 40 years. So he reigned into his 70s. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over Israel 33 years. In another place, it just says 7 years and 33 years. So 7.5, 7, whatever. Tomato. What's the difference? It's not an exact 360-day year. That's what they had, 360-day years. We have 365 days here. There's no way to reconcile it exactly with what we're doing. So he's a young man, really, at 30. It would be difficult. Don't you think it would be difficult to recognize a person as king at the age of 30? But he was a remarkable guy. He doesn't have all the wisdom of age, but he'll get there. He'll get there to be 70. So this is from the beginning to the end of his reign. This is a summary. Next slide, please. Jerusalem. Joshua had brought the people into the promised land, tried to conquer all the people that were in the promised land. He died, and then the judges rose up, and the Israelites took possession of this, and then the Amorites took possession of this, and they fought back and forth, and there were different leaders all over the place. And they were never able to conquer Jebus, which is Jerusalem. And it was the last holdout. And the reason it was the last holdout is because it was, if I can say this word right, you couldn't penetrate it. Let me say it that way. Impregnable. Is that the right way to say it? You could not penetrate it because it was on the top of a hill, and there were huge stone walls up there, and they would close it off, and they would close the gate, and there was just no way. It was too steep to get up there, and when they got up there, they could throw stuff down on you, throw rocks down on you, and arrows and so forth, and you just couldn't get in there. Have you ever, Paula, when you were in Germany, did you see the castles with the big walls? And a lot of times they were on the top of the hill, and the robber barons would rob you as you went by because there was nothing you could do about it because they were protected by these walls. Well, Jerusalem isn't that well protected today because you can fly a missile in there, but in those days, in bow and arrow days, and spear days, and rock throwing days, slingshot days, there was just no way to get in it. And so the king marched against the city. David marched against the city of Jebus. It says here Jerusalem, but that's what it was named later, which means the city of peace, against the Jebusites. And the inhabitants of the land said to David, "You will not come in here. The blind and the lame will turn you back." We can take the poorest people, people that are disadvantaged, people who can't see, will be able to throw rocks over the wall and kill you, and you won't be able to come in here. And people that can't even walk without a cane or without a wheelchair, they will be able to turn you away from the city because we are protected. You know, without God, we're not protected. This will preach. Without God, we're not protected. And they thought, we have the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. We're protected. We've got food stored up. You will not come in here. Well, what's that story of Achilles? Yeah, he's got that heel. It's the weak spot. And a lot of times we don't even know what the weak spot is. And we have to say that these people in Jebus, they had a weak spot, but they didn't know it. And David, being the smart guy that he is, probably had good counsel from other people on how you might be able to get on the top of that hill. And I'm going to show you some pictures of it. I mean, it is really impressive because you can go there today and see it. David cannot come in here. The blind and the lame will turn you back. Now that's arrogance. That's pride. That's snarky. Next one, please, Aretha. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold, which is now the city of David. So the author is looking back. Nevertheless, they said he couldn't come in there, but he did, and he changed the name of it to the city of David. He did it. How did he do it? What's the one thing that we cannot live without for very long? Water. Well, there's a problem, or there was, probably not anymore, because they've got water towers and things like that, and they can pump it up, and everybody can take a shower. 15-minute shower like I did this morning. I'm sure it's not a problem to have a glass of water at a restaurant, but in those days, it was a problem. It was a weakness in the city of Jerusalem, and the people in Jerusalem knew it. or they should have known it. And David saw what he could do. Water. Are you following what's happening in the West? No water. No rain. And the farmers are getting the water for their crops, but there's not enough water for the cities. It's a problem. It's a natural problem. When they weren't sucking all the water off the rivers for their strawberries. How many of you bought strawberries at Wegmans recently? Or nuts or other fruits? Fruits and nuts come from California. I don't know if you knew that. But all our vegetables are grown there. If they're not grown in Mexico, which used to be, California used to be part of Mexico. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. We went and took it away from them. That's what the problem is on the border. The Mexicans think they ought to be able to come here because it's Mexico, New Mexico. It's actually, New Mexico is actually Old Mexico, depending on your view. Water. How long can you last without water? Not more than a week, I wouldn't think. That some people say 3 days or something like that. You can go without food a lot longer, but you have to have water. So David said on that day, on the day that they said, the blind and the lame will turn you away, whoever would strike down the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, those whom David hates. Therefore it said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. If we want to get in, we have to get in the water shaft. Well, what is the water shaft? The water shaft was not actually a water shaft. The water shaft was a shaft that allowed the people in Jerusalem to get to the water. There wasn't any water running in the water shaft. The shaft went down to where the water was. And so David figured, we can get in this way. Now the problem with the water shaft is that in most part, it goes straight up and only one person at a time can get through it. But below there's another shaft. Here's what it looks like. We see down in the, oops, that's me that went the wrong way. Let's see if I could go page up so I can see it. There we go. In the lower right, we see the Kidron Valley and the Gihon Spring. And then if you look about halfway up, you see the Jebusite city wall. This is the oldest wall. And then there's an Israelite wall, which is above that, which is like twice as high. And so what they had to do, the Jebusites, what they had to do is they had to go down into that shaft, come over to the east, and then go straight down to Hezekiah's tunnel and go over and get water and then take it back up. And it was the only way in. And it doesn't mention it here in 2 Samuel, but it does mention in this narrative in the book of 1 Chronicles that David said, whoever goes up first gets to be the commander of my army. And Joab said, I'm in. And they climbed up that shaft, and if you look at the up and down on the very left, it looks like it is about 45 feet straight up. Just wide enough to get a person and his sword through there. The Jebusites didn't think it possible. And so I suspect it was at night. It doesn't say it was at night, but they sneaked up through there one by one, by one, by one. And they conquered the fortress within the fortress. Now, they did not conquer the whole city. There was a tower in this highest spot with a wall all the way around it, and they conquered the highest spot. And David went up there, and it became known as the city of David. And outside the wall in the city of Jebus were the Jebusites, and they were not able to conquer them. And that's why it says, when it talks about in Psalm 110, it says, is it 110? Rule in the midst of your enemies. Because David is inside their city, but the people who are around him are enemies. And so the idea is that when Messiah comes, he will rule in the midst of his enemies, which is the idea of the church being in the world with all the people who are against God around them. It's a concept. And so they sneaked up. Some people say snuck. Is it snucked or sneak? Sneaked, Kelly. My mother always said it was sneaked, and I think she's right, but no, everybody says snuck. They crawled up there when nobody was looking. And they took that property at the top. Now, here's where it goes straight up. Can you see that on the next slide, please? They've got handrails and stairs and stuff in there now because, it probably cost you $45 to go up through this thing if you want to today. It's probably like an amusement ride. And so it's larger on the horizontal, but on the straight it's only enough for one person. And so here's a picture of it from the inside, and the next slide is looking down into it. Can you imagine warriors coming out of that? Like cockroaches out of a little hole in the wall. Your enemies sneak up there during the night, and when you wake up in the morning, you find out that your whole area has been taken over by the enemy. You can look at this positively or negatively. Is there a little area, let's look at it negatively, is there a little area where evil has entrance into your life? There is an Achilles heel probably with all of us. We all have our own certain temptations that we struggle with, am I right? And so it's like this little place where the devil can get in. Or if you look at it positively, maybe you have a little place in your heart where God can get in. That'd be a better water shaft. So David occupied the stronghold. So this is at the end of the story. Named it the city of David. David built the city around all from the Millo, or Millo, I don't know how you pronounce that. The scholars don't know what that is. It's been so long that nobody remembers. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. God did this for him, not himself. Not his own ability to be a warrior, not his ability to convince the tribes around him that he was the man for the job. It happened because God was with him. So, next slide, please. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, along with cedar trees and carpenters and masons who built David a house. David then perceived that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. It wasn't until his house was built that he realized God had done it. He knew God was with him. He knew what he had to do when he was a warrior. We knew what he had to do when he was in exile. But he came to this place after Hiram had sent him cedar trees. Now, the Bible talks about the cedars of Lebanon. There are no cedars in Lebanon anymore. They cut them all down and put them into stuff. Now, cedar lasts a long time. In our house in Hopewell, where Daisy lives now, there used to be cedar, there is cedar siding on it, but there used to be cedar steps, and one of them cracked in half, and we had to get rid of it because it was broken in half, but it was cedar. It was like brand new. Cedar lasts a very, very, very long time. And so here we find Hiram, who we're going to see later. Hiram is the guy who later is the guy who procures all of the things for the temple and sends them to David, or sends them to Solomon, David's son. So years and years later, Hiram, here's the first place where we see him. And so they build a house, and it's like a castle on Seneca Point. Only it's all cedar. And David realizes that he's become the king, not for his own sake, but for the sake of the people of Israel. So there we have another, beginning to end kind of story. After all this stuff happens, so we're going way into the future from the narrative of our story. Then he realizes that it's not for David's own sake, it's for the sake of the people. Next slide. Now here it is. You probably can't even imagine how big, these are the stones that where the house stood. But there's a huge valley on the other side, and you can look across to the other mountain, and here's people standing underneath the foundation of that house. Why did he need such a huge mansion? Nobody had a cedar house. And the scholars point out that this area of Zion, or the city of David, is only 12 acres. We have 3. Our property, multiply it by 4, that's how big Zion is. You would think it's a lot bigger, but it wasn't. It's a citadel in the city that David was able to capture, but not the city around it. So, why did he need such a big place? Next slide. In Jerusalem, after he came from Hebron, David took more concubines and wives, sons and daughters were born. These are the names. Want me to read them? I'll do it. Shammua, Shlobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliadad, Eliaphet. In Chronicles, it gives this list. David took more wives at Jerusalem. Now notice the difference. In Samuel it says wives and concubines. In Chronicles it says wives. Because there really isn't much difference between a wife and a concubine. I mean, in 21st century United States, there is a difference. I mean, we'd say wives and lovers. But a concubine was like a second-class wife. They weren't necessarily living someplace else. They were living in the harem. Do you know why Saudi Arabia is called Saudi Arabia? Because King Saud took over from this guy, from this harem that he had. So it's not just an ancient practice, it's relatively current. And so now which one of the descendants of Saud is going to be king? Well, that's, one will kill another, and one will get political intrigue going, and somebody gets thrown out, and somebody gets arrested, and if you follow the news, they're arresting each other for different things. Now, notice in the one on the right, we've got, at the very bottom, we have one Nogeg. Such a pretty little girl. What are you calling her? Nogeg. See, their names are way different than ours. But notice that Eliaphet is mentioned twice. See, Eliaphet over here on the left, and then if you go over to where the arrow is, it's Elphet, but it's the same name. It's a nickname. And then Eliaphet is listed underneath. I don't know if my kids even know this, but when my grandmother and my grandfather got married, they had a son named Jean. Jean in French, spelled Jean. He changed it to Gene. Can you imagine if you were named Jean, like a girl's Jean? Well, he was, and he didn't like it. But then my grandmother conceived a second child, which was stillborn. Did you know that? And it was a real problem because the baby had died within her, and with the abortion laws and stuff like that, there was nothing that could be done. So eventually, she almost died of toxic shock syndrome, and if she had, none of us would be here. And so when the baby was stillborn, they named him Richard. And then years and years and years later, they got divorced, and my grandfather got married again, and they had a child, and they named him Richard. You didn't know that, did you? Did you know? Where's Andrew? He's next door. We'll have to let him know. So it's possible to have two children with the same name. And that's what the scholars think happened here. They think that one of the kids passed away and they just named another kid because these are people from different mothers. And then Nogah was probably, Chronicles was written a little bit after, so there was another child born, so there's another child added to this list that's not on the Samuel list. Well, you say, okay, that's 13. But what about the older kids? Sons were born to David at Hebron. His first was Ammon, second Chileab, third Absalom, fourth Adonijah, fifth Shaphathiah, and Ithream. And then there's one daughter mentioned, Tamar. So when you add 7 and 13, you come up with 20. He needs a big cedar house. It's not two people living in a castle on the lake. It's a house filled with bedrooms. No running water. They got to go down through the thing to get their water. So he had people hired, probably very small people, very strong people, go down that 45 feet and walk over and bring a couple very strong people. That's how they got their water. So, how many of you understand that a family with, we know that all of these older kids are born of different women, so we have to assume, and they're all boys in this list, and Tamar is mentioned elsewhere, but she's not in this list. But when you go over to the list in Chronicles, it's sons and daughters. So we don't know which ones were female and which one were male. I looked it up specifically. It specifically says Ben and Bat, which means sons and daughters. Here it just lists sons. Is a harem with, say, probably 13 or 14 wives and 20 children, is this going to be problematic? Is this the will of God? Did David do the right thing here? Next slide, please. Deuteronomy, many years earlier. You may indeed set over a king, one of your own community. You may set a king over you. You're not permitted to put a foreigner over you who's not of your own community. He must not acquire many wives for himself. Or else his heart will turn away, or silver or gold. He must not acquire great quantities for himself. And when he's taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of the law for him in the presence of the Levitical priest, and it shall remain with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God diligently over all the words of this law and these statutes. So it was very clear that the king was to be given this directive, and he was to be given the Bible as he had it in the day, and he was to read the law of God, and he was not to seek for wealth. He was not to seek for political entanglements with the nations around by marrying the king's daughters, and he's not supposed to do it, and yet He did it. And it was the curse on his life. Did God love him? Scriptures say that he did. Was he a man after God's heart? That's what the scriptures decide. Suppose when I die, somebody comes in and says, I'd like to be the pastor here. Oh yeah, how many children do you have? I have 20, all by different women. Oh, we'd like to put this person up for nomination for the President of the United States. Oh, I have 20 kids by a dozen different women. Is that going to fly? You know, by the time of Jesus, this was not the case. It was about whether it was permissible to divorce your wife or not. And Jesus said in the beginning that it's one man and one woman. One man and one woman. Man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they shall become one flesh. They say that people make the claim that Jesus didn't say anything about homosexuality. He certainly did. He said the right way is one man, one woman. And so the king he's acquired everything that God wanted for him. However, he has disqualified himself in many ways. He's not going to be able to give counsel on marriage etiquette. You want a bishop? Okay. He must be the husband of one wife. Now, a bishop is not a pastor. I mean, that's a misinterpretation. A bishop is a person who's over an area of churches, and so he has to have his family in order. Not a drunkard, not a lover of money, which is, basically what these things are as far as what's required of a king. Can we find somebody that's not after money and not after sex and not after power? Very hard to find a person like that. So there's one more section after this, but fortunately for you, I don't have time for it, and I knew I wouldn't. So let me see the next slide. If anyone breaks God's law, that person cannot escape the consequences. And what he did with his polygamy was not good. Now, you say, well, we don't have polygamy today. Yes, we do. In Africa, there's polygamy. And there's polygamy in the church in Africa. Because what happens is, a person has several wives, and they become a Christian. Now what? So some people said, well, he's got to get rid of all his other wives. It's men that do this, not women. And then others said, well, that's kind of harsh. What are the other wives going to do when they get thrown out? They got no way to support themselves. And so the other thought was, okay, you can be a member of our church, but you can't be in leadership because, it's not a good example. And so we demand that you don't marry anymore. Take care of the ones you have, and polygamy will die out because the church will get greater and greater, and then in the next generation, one man will marry one woman, and everything will be good. Well, that only works if society has changed. But you can go over there today, and you can find people that have 5 wives. And among Muslims, they can have 5 wives. In Arabia and in India and different places, polygamy is still a thing. And it's still a thing in Utah in some places, although undercover. So he has brought upon himself a huge amount of problems which will play out in the next chapters. So he got everybody to come and agree, made a covenant, everybody's working together. He goes in, he captures inside Jerusalem, Hiram builds him a huge house, he gets a big family. The next section is all of the Philistines that he defeated and brought peace to the whole country. We'll talk about that next week. But as a result of this one thing, even though he did other things that were not good, this brought him more heartache than anything. And can you think of any issue in people's lives that is worse than a situation with, broken marriages and kids hating each other in one family? That's what all happens because of this man's lust. He wasn't in it for power, but lust was certainly his problem. Well, you might say, well, if I lived in that time, there were a lot of women that were, they had husbands that were killed in battle, and who's going to take care of these women? And I'm going to do a good thing, and I'm going to take care of all these women that husbands were killed in my campaigns. And maybe the intent was good, but in the end, it wasn't good. We're way over on time, but anybody absolutely have to get out within 5 minutes? What do you have to say?
Okay, so you're really speaking to me because Tess is getting married next Sunday. And
who's doing it?
And you're doing it. Thank you so much. And so this week she said to me, first of all the wives that are here, it's going to be Dennis and I on her side, and it's going to be 2 families on the other side because Billy's parents are divorced. It was not a good divorce. And so we're hoping, she's praying that everybody can get along. She's had to make sure that there's absolutely no favoritism shown for either of the spouses and their, current spouses. And it's been, it's stealing away from the joy of the whole thing. So it gets complicated.
Well, imagine those poor folks who are divorced. Imagine the pain in their own lives because of this.
Right.
We have to feel sorry for them.
So we're praying for everybody to get along and safe travel.
Thank you. Good point, Priscilla. Anyone else? Ricky? Or Richard? I guess you go by Richard now, don't you?
Kevin, you can call me Rick. You can call me Ricky.
But don't anybody else. Everybody else call him Richard.
I'm just curious. In Deuteronomy, it said, "Shall not have many wives."
Shall not multiply wives.
Okay, so it's one. I mean, today we would say, well, what's the definition of many? 3's not so many. I think I could manage 3, but
I'll bet you can't.
But the context is, it really means one, right? Correct? Because we have that in the New Testament with Paul about elders, and they should be the husband of one wife, stuff like that. So. But
then the question in the New Testament is it one at a time?
Yeah, I know. We're slick. Take that bow and arrow and just turn around and I forget who it is, but he just turns around. He doesn't aim at anything. He aims it up into the air, and it finds the spot in the armor and kills him.
Yeah, one of David's descendants.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry to went over 15 minutes. I hope it was worth it for you.